Welcome to another episode of Stories from the Edge of Life. Today we have another special guest, Lisa White, who is a social worker. Lisa, would you mind introducing yourself to our audience, please?
Hello, how are you?
Great.
Hi, Dr. Bharadwaj. Yes, I'm Lisa White, social worker, and I've been doing working in this field for many years now.
Great. So, Lisa, we have an international audience. Would you mind sharing very briefly what exactly does a social worker do?
Social workers are trained to help people. It's very broad. They're trained to help people find resources. They're trained to provide clinical services through psychotherapy. They work in many different settings with people in different age groups and in different circumstances to make sure they get what they need to reach their personal goals and to cope with life's challenges. So that's what they do in general.
Great. And just for the sake of our audience, you practice in the United States. So that is
Yes,
an
I do.
overall, that's an overall, in a nutshell, role of what a social worker plays, right?
Yes. And they're
Great.
trained at different levels, bachelor's level, master's level, and some have PhDs, depending on what they're doing.
Awesome.
Mhm.
Now, you've also worked as a palliative care social worker. So what does a palliative care
Okay.
social worker do that is different from what a typical social worker does?
Well, it's specialized. They are able to use the skills that they use in other settings. Typically, or often they work in a hospital setting, not always, but often. And they work with people who have chronic conditions that are ultimately terminal at any point in time across the disease. And they help facilitate meetings with families, patients and families regarding their conditions. And they help them to have the information that they need to make medical decisions that are sometimes difficult. They also make referrals when appropriate to end-of-life resources.
Got it. So you not only help patients, but also their family members?
Yes, yes, the patients and the families. A great deal of the work has to do with supporting families as they support their loved ones.
Got it. So myself as a doctor, quite often the intervention that I am involved with is prescribing medications.
Mm-hmm.
And the intervention of a typical palliative care social worker is the conversation or conversations,
Yes.
right?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. So, because in this forum, we talk about stories from the edge of life, could you share some instances that you've had with patients and their families that could demonstrate a little bit more about what a typical palliative care social worker is able to help patients and their families with?
Yes. One thing is to communicate. Oftentimes patients and their families are presented with a great deal of information regarding the person's medical status. And depending on the nature of the information, it can be overwhelming just in terms of the volume of information. Oftentimes people have no familiarity with the medicalese, and also they're reacting to it emotionally. And so what a social worker does in conjunction with the rest of the palliative care team, which can include a physician and the nurse practitioner, is to help them process the information and give them a forum to to think about it, to recognize and express their feelings about it, and to make decisions about it, the patient and the family. So it can be a very overwhelming time in patients' lives, because oftentimes they're dealing with the unknown. There's a lot of fear. There is a lot of, can't think of the right word. It's more like angst, because they haven't been in the situation before oftentimes, and they can't always hear all of the information because the emotional aspect, their emotions intervene. And so supporting patients and their families through this decision-making process, and just kind of being there and giving them an opportunity to recognize, acknowledge their feelings, and still be able to think logically is a process. And that's one thing that social workers support with. And so you asked about examples, right?
Right, go ahead.
They're many and varied. Sometimes people are very focused, they're very competent in other areas of their life. And when they get into situations regarding the healthcare of their loved ones, oftentimes they're just kind of stumped. And so the skills that they have in other areas aren't necessarily applicable. And so a lot of times they just want the information, and they just ignore the fact that it's an emotional situation. And so I can think of an example of a family that was very professional, very educated, they excelled in their chosen field, and they all worked in the same field. And so they were used to being right and having information and being in control. But in this particular situation, they weren't. And so we talked about all the details, and they were ready to go. And so I stopped and said, well, tell me about you. What about you and your support? Who's there for you? How are you feeling? What kind of support do you have? And that was off-putting. They hadn't considered themselves. They were thinking about the facts. They were thinking about their loved one. As long as they're okay, I'm okay. But once I said that, the whole tone changed. I could see them physically relaxing. And they were very demonstrative in terms of thanking me and my colleague for thinking about them and giving them a forum to consider themselves in the process. And that was our first meeting. And over time, I think the patient was there for about a week or two. They were always welcoming to us, to me, to my colleague, because they knew we were there not only for the patient, but also for them. And so it gave them an opportunity to let their guard down a little bit and to consider some of their needs as well.
That's great. It sounds like you got the persons or the individuals out of their professional shell.
Absolutely. Yeah, because they come with the skills that they're used to using. And this situation sometimes requires something different. It's not all here. It's also in your heart. And so many times people aren't comfortable exploring their own emotions or acknowledging them. But oftentimes the situations are intense and emotional. We deal with fear, anticipatory grief, loss, all of it. And so most people aren't really comfortable with that.
what I found striking was in a highly emotionally charged situation, you're trying to help patients and their family members make logical decisions.
Right.
Right. So you're trying to
Yes.
tease out the logic in these very highly charged emotional situations, emotions that usually run very high.
Yes.
Because, like you said, a lot of times you get involved when they're life-changing events. So, what are some of the strategies you use?
Well, again, palliative care social work does draw upon the other skills that I've honed as a social worker. So the first thing is to develop a rapport with the patient. So you greet them, you're respectful. I think it's really helpful when you have researched the patient's condition and are knowledgeable, because they respect that. They know that you know what you're talking about. The other thing is listening really intently. And we as social workers are trained to listen actively. And so hearing them and also observing them, what they're saying, what they're not saying, their nonverbal, being observant of the interaction among the family members and between them and the patient. And also guiding the situation gently, guiding the conversation gently, the discussion, because you're getting to know them. And recognizing that you may have time to develop a relationship, or you don't have time. Sometimes things are happening so quickly and decisions need to be made so quickly that you really don't have the luxury of time. Other times you are going to see the person multiple times during the person's stay, the patient's stay. So you don't necessarily have to solve everything at once. And you can get to know the person and they can trust you. I have a great example for that one. There was a couple, and the patient was concerned about her loved one because she knew that his emotional expression or reality was limited. And he didn't talk much about his feelings, but she knew that he needed support around that. And we met this person, the team, several times, and he was reticent to speak to us about anything related to his loved one's terminal condition. We could talk to her about it, but not to him. He kind of avoided us. He didn't want to talk. And when her condition deteriorated, he came and sought us out. We didn't push him. We didn't try to force him to have conversations that he wouldn't have. We just would come and say hello. We just come and check on you. And the patient, we just want to say hello. We want you to know that we're here. And when he needed us, he found our card and he asked the nurse to come get us. And so I spent time just sitting with him. The patient was in the bed in distress. And I just kind of talked to him about things, and he opened up in ways that I hadn't expected. And I was able to offer him support at a really critical time in the patient's life and his. And that's because I was patient with him and didn't try to force him to move beyond his comfort zone. We were still communicating with the patient, who was alert for much of the time toward the end of her life. But we had to wait for him to be ready, and we didn't try to rush it.
Sorry, I muted myself.
That's
It's
okay.
very interesting because it sounds like your intervention requires a process to occur.
Yes.
And sometimes because of the pressure of time, that process needs to be sped up because
Yes.
decisions need to be made. And
Mhm.
and then at times when you have the luxury of having some more time, you're just there for patients and their families and allowing them to open up when they feel comfortable to do so.
Yes.
Outstanding.
Mhm.
I do want to ask you one or two questions
Mhm.
based on some of the words you used.
Mhm.
Active listening, how is that different from listening?
Well, I think that's the part that gets lost with most people, because when they see you talking, they say, well, I can talk to somebody. What's the big deal? But again, it's hearing what the person is saying, but also observing what they're doing, the nonverbal, their posture, their facial expressions, and also hearing what they're not saying, because some things get left out and they don't add up. And so pursuing those unanswered questions can make a difference. So I recognized, and I would say that this is the only time this person has ever talked to a mental health professional. And this will probably be the only time they ever do. This is it. I'm it. And oftentimes people would share things with me that they'd never shared with anyone. And I was the first and last person that they would ever talk to about their feelings around caring for their loved one, other stressors they were having that were competing with the stress of having a sick loved one with an illness, all kinds of things. And I was it. I was called upon to intervene with a situation with staff. A brother said, my brother's on the way up there. You need to talk to him. And because it's not going to go well, he's very upset with the way things were handled. I said, I will meet him at the pass. And I went and spoke to him. And because we developed a rapport in terms of communication, I listened to him. I gave him an opportunity to share his perspective. I was respectful to him. He felt that I was a person in the environment, the hospital, that was a place that he didn't particularly like to come. He thought that I was someone that was safe, that he could talk to. So that's a really important relationship to establish through listening and making a person feel that they're being heard.
Great. I think that's a lesson we can all walk away with.
Mhm.
Another thing that you mentioned was anticipatory grief.
Mhm.
Would you mind elaborating on what that is and how do you prepare family members?
That's a hard one. It's knowing and not wanting to know, but it's knowing that a person's time on earth is nigh, their death is near. And sometimes it's incomprehensible to imagine life without that person, but they're preparing themselves for the inevitable. And it's still different from when it actually happens, but they're kind of trying to work through the fact that, wow, this could be it. And so oftentimes they need some support to do that.
Great. I'm glad patients get to get the support of professionals like yourself. I've had the pleasure actually of, for the sake of full disclosure with everybody who's watching, of having worked with you.
Yes.
And it was just great to have you as a colleague. Although it was a little bit short in my opinion.
Me too.
Right. So, in today's time and age, we use the terminology TMI, too much information. And you mentioned patients and their family members really open up. Have you had instances where you're like received information which has been like, maybe this is something that I don't need to hear?
Well, depending on the situation, we can kind of become, we being the team can become kind of the fabric. And when patients allow us in, we become part of them to some degree. We kind of maintain professional boundaries, but we were invited to a funeral. And we didn't go, but we were invited. And people sometimes forget that we're there because we're just kind of coming. They're used to seeing us come to visit, to spend some time. And so we hear things, but we keep it all in the context of, helping the family, supporting the family. People say things, I'm a mandatory reporter when people are in danger of hurting themselves or others. And so people say things that they may or may not mean, but they say them. And so I have to be conscious of that and let their physicians know, and, but it's all part of it, because we see people at their best, we see them at their worst. We hear about family dynamics. There are many families who have loved ones from whom they're estranged. And so we hear about that. We're there at a critical juncture. And so all bets are off in some degrees, to some extent.
Yeah, so one of the situations that professionals like yourself and me, we find having these family meetings with multiple family members with, at times, a lot of conflict.
Yes.
And it's often because the patient didn't have the opportunity of sharing their wishes with their family members.
Yes.
And assigning a surrogate decision maker.
Yes.
Would you mind sharing a situation where, number one, what is the maximum number of family members you've had in a family meeting? And tell us about a situation where there was a lot of conflict within the family members. Because what I've noticed a lot of times, what ends up happening is then the focus shifts from the patient, and it's the family that is sort of like becomes the center of attention and the dynamic as well.
Several examples are coming to mind. So they're competing in my head. I am going to give one. I expected to speak to the patient's spouse. She said that she had some children, adult children, too. And so that's what we expected. I felt bad because we made the meeting the night before, and I was afraid that this woman was not going to sleep that night. So I was concerned about her. So we get to the patient's room, and there were about 7 people there. And while we were there, several people were brought in by telephone, through FaceTime and other platforms. Literally, some people came with various mobility issues. We had people coming from out of town, and people brought babies in strollers. There ended up being about 15 people in the room and several by electronic media. And the patient himself was not conscious. So we were talking primarily to his wife. And there was conflict in terms of what to do. And one of the children who was present physically was having a really hard time. We had to keep redirecting the questions to the wife and establishing her as the decision maker. And it was difficult, but we were able to do it. And at one point, the child who's having a hard time stepped out of the room and went into the waiting area. And I went in there and spoke with her and talked to her and said, acknowledged that she had a special relationship with her father, the patient. And I said to her, "You seem like a daddy's girl." And she said, "Yes." I said, "I understand that." And we talked about their relationship and how it was difficult and how it's going to be hard, but she could get some support and who could be there to support her. And she recognized that it was her mother's decision, and the mother was able to make the decision that she thought her husband wanted. And we absolutely made a difference in that family. And he subsequently died the next morning. And the family was able to see him. And when it was time, his wife said, "Okay, it's time. Everyone who's seen him has had an opportunity to do so." So we supported them throughout that process. But it was not easy. There were a lot of people with all of their emotions to manage, and he was very well loved. So I'm glad we had an opportunity to be there.
Great. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about the circumstances? It seems like the patient's wife chose a more conservative route rather than an aggressive route.
Yes.
Just so that, there might be some people watching this who might think, well, why wouldn't somebody just choose to keep on treating their loved one? And why would somebody even make a decision to maybe perhaps wean off or not offer certain treatments to their loved ones? If you wouldn't mind sharing that perspective, that would be great.
Okay. Well, the thing is, we hope that people have spoken to their loved ones about some decisions they make, but it doesn't always happen that way. We hope that the medical decision maker, sometimes it's by default because they haven't necessarily designated anyone, but each state here in the US has a rank ordering. And so oftentimes it's the spouse. And she knows her husband, hopefully. And she is acting, the medical decision maker is acting as a mouthpiece. So they aren't making a decision. They are relaying the decision that the patient would make based on knowing the patient's wants and values. And perhaps the person had been in that situation before as a loved one watching someone else go through this process. And they had said things, maybe they've said things like, "I wouldn't want this type of treatment. I would want this type of treatment." And just through knowing them and experiencing life with them, hopefully they have a perspective and they're acting on the patient's behalf, which takes pressure off of the loved one. We say to them, you know them, what would they want? And you are acting as their mouthpiece. You're speaking when they can't. You're relaying what they would say. And that takes the pressure off them. And it also helps put it in a context for the other family members who may or may not agree with the choices that are being made. And so through family meetings, we can kind of discern some of those values that the patient has.
I think the key is what would the patient want rather than what do we want for the patient to go through.
Exactly.
For the outcome we desire, right?
Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, fantastic. We've covered a lot of ground.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we will wind up this video for now.
Okay.
We will get to hear a little bit more about why you chose this particular field. And one of the things that I've noticed is you've dealt with a lot of difficult situations with patients and families. At the same time, you're a very positive person, very cheerful. So how do you sort of cope in terms of finding that right balance to keep yourself going when you take care of such patients and their families? So more to come.
Yes.
In another episode with you.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much for your service.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bradwash.
All right.
Did you like this story? If so, please subscribe to this channel and like and share the video. Want more? Buy the book, Stories from the Edge of Life, available now on Amazon for more stories like this. All proceeds support Palliative Care Network, a nonprofit dedicated to alleviating suffering and improving the quality of life for patients facing end-of-life issues. Consider extending your contribution by donating through the link below. Thank you for your support.